Hi everyone, this is the unlikely story that will take us from the cold north deep into Europe, down to the Ottoman Empire and further down to Egypt, there and back again. It is also the story of a young king, a hero king, a tragic king, and a mummy king. I am your host Martin Eriksson. Welcome to Ancient History. At the beginning of the 1700s, the Swedish status as a great power in the Baltic region was starting to fall apart. It had risen as a great power in the late 1500s and been the supreme victor of the 30 Years' War between 1618 and 1648, securing its domain, almost making the Baltic Sea its Mare Nostrum. In 1697, however, the King Charles XI died. His son, Karl XII, Charles XII, or Charlie Dosen, as we sometimes call him, gained the throne. At the time, he was only 16 years old. Seeing the Swedish power as weakened in the hands of a young king, a triple alliance of Denmark-Norway, Saxon-Poland, and Russia declared war on Sweden on the 11th of January 1700. The war that is known as the Great Nordic War was to last for 21 years, leaving Sweden's power severely sprained. I shall not dwell on the details of the war, but being attacked from 3 directions, Sweden had a hard time defending its domains. However, it soon became clear that the aggressors had severely underestimated the young king. The grand opening of the Swedish counter-offensive came in November 1700, when Swedish troops, the so-called Carolinians, stormed a much superior force at the town of Narva in Estonia. The town had been occupied by Tsar Peter earlier that year. The Russian forces were routed in harsh weather conditions. The young king led his troops from the front and would continue to do so throughout the war, making him the last warrior king of Europe. The victory also made him a hero in Swedish mythology in the centuries to come. In the following years, Swedish troops fought countless battles, mainly in Poland and Central Europe, being mostly successful and victorious. As a result of this success, in 1707, the time had come to strike the defining blow against Tsar Peter, later called the Great. Swedish armies started to attack Russian troops, liberating lost territory, and tried to force Tsar Peter to a decisive battle. The king made his way east, and in late June 1709, the Swedish and Russian forces and their kings stood outside the fortified town of Poltava in Ukraine. The drums started beating the attack of the 28th of June 1709. For reasons debated and analyzed ever since, the Swedish army at this day suffered a meltdown and the attack was crushed. Most troops were later forced to surrender after having retreated towards the river Dnipro. While in retreat, the king that was wounded and his officers pondered on what to do. In the dire circumstances, a decision was made to cross the river with a force of 3,000 troops and Cossacks, and to try to seek refuge in the Ottoman Empire. The river was crossed 3 days after the defeat at Poltava. The king and parts of the remaining army later reached what was then Moldavia under Ottoman rule. Now you may all wonder, what has this to do with ancient history and the title of this episode? Well, the story is about to take a completely different direction. King Charles XII and his officers and soldiers were to remain in Ottoman lands for 5 years, not returning home. From here, the king tried to coordinate the war effort and also tried to get the Ottomans to commit to the war against Russia. All was not war, however, and the king had a thirst for knowledge and stories of adventures in strange lands. During his time in Bender, the king sent out a total of 3 expeditions to the Holy Land and the Near East. Of these, we know the most of the second expedition, and it was led by a man named Michael Eneman. Eneman had studied at the university in Uppsala. His studies included linguistics, Greek, and the languages of the Orient. He also nurtured a great interest in books and the history of learning. It can therefore be of interest to know that while in Uppsala he quite possibly came in contact with a mummy, as it turned out also his first mummy. This mummy had been in the university's possession since already in the early 1600s, when it was gifted to Gustav II Adolf, or Gustav the Great, the Lion from the North, who had brought Sweden into victory in the 30 Years' War, but had got himself killed at the Battle of Lützen in 1632. The mummy had shortly thereafter been put on display in the Anatomical Theatre in Uppsala. We know that the mummy still existed as late as in 1720, although it is suspected that it was by then in rather poor state due to the unfavorable climate. We cannot know for sure that Eneman actually saw it, but I would say that it is highly likely. There was a growing interest in Egypt and mummies, and Eneman had a specific interest in ancient culture. As a note, the first Swedish thesis on mummies was written already in 1739 here in my hometown of Lund. At the outbreak of the Great Nordic War, Eneman is recruited to the field office. Hence, he follows the army and the king to Poltava, and is among the few that crosses the river after the defeat. Eneman does not stay with the king and his staff in Bender, but seemed to have been living in Constantinople for at least 2 years, probably as the king's emissary, when he in early 1711 becomes the head of the second of the king's expeditions. The journey will take him and his companions to places like Troy, Smyrna, Ephesus, Chios, Samos, Rhodos, Alexandria, Cairo, the Sinai Desert, Jaffa, Jerusalem, Bethlehem, and the Dead Sea, and Cyprus. It is quite a fantastic journey for the pupil of the ancient world. Now, on the 23rd of July in 1711, Eneman, together with the chamber councilman Johann Silverkrantz and Claude Lemarie, son of the French general consul in Cairo, and a knowledgeable translator, finds himself in front of the Pyramid of Cheops. They are standing on its northern side where the entrance is. Eneman describes how the entrance is partly blocked by sands and how he must crawl inside. He is meticulously detailed in his recordings, and he measures the inside of the pyramid. He enters the Queen's chamber, which is in bad shape and at the time apparently smelled horribly, and also visits 3 wells inside the structure. Eneman's journey through the pyramid is accompanied by his scientific mind, commenting on ancient authors, questioning the statements. Here, he actually comments on Plinius, who theorized that the pyramids stood atop of the Nile, but concludes that he can't find any answer on that topic. The small group also reaches the king's chamber, commenting on the stone coffin. One must remember that in the early 1700s, no one really knew anything about Egypt, besides what could be read in old Greek and Roman and biblical texts. This was because no one could yet read the hieroglyphs. These were not to be deciphered until the find of the Rosetta Stone in 1799. Curiously, the Old Testament hold the peoples before the deluge to have been giants, and this is because this was a time when gods and humans had intercourse and children. And although very few probably believed this literally, no one really knew who the ancient Egyptians had been. Eneman soberly concludes that the inhabitant of the coffin certainly would have been a fairly normal-sized human being. He dismisses the idea of giants and comments on it by referring to Juvenalis. Ne genus hoc viro iam decrescebat Homero, because also in the age of Homeros, the human race was reclining, which is from Juvenalis' satire about the Egyptians. The pyramids of Giza is only one of the places visited by the group while in Egypt, and we know that they also traveled to Saqqara and the large ancient cemetery complexes found there. in search for mummies. Eneman actually mentions that he had the permission from the king to try to find a mummy. Together with his companions, he is lowered into a shaft of the gravesite, close to the Pyramid of Djoser, but makes a disappointed remark that all the mummies are gone, and that the French has taken the most of them. Why this is so might be a subject for a later episode. As they come back to Cairo, Michael Eneman comments on the Egyptian mummification process and burial practices, and reveals the fact that here he is present during the unraveling of an ancient mummy, a sort of event that would gain increasing popularity in the centuries to come. On their way back, the route goes via Smyrna, but at this point both Eneman and his friend Silverkrans has managed to get infected by tuberculosis, of which Eneman would die in 1714, just 2 months after returning to Sweden. Eventually, Eneman managed to get back to the king and his field office in exile in June of 1713, which was now located at Edirne, or Adrianople, close to today's border between Turkey and Bulgaria. Tradition has it that the king was so fascinated by Eneman's journeys that he listened to the stories of Eneman for 1 hour each week in the coming years. We also know that Eneman eventually got hold of a mummy, because it was sent to the king's camp and studied there. However, there is no record on if that mummy was unraveled in the presence of the king. But it seems likely. In any case, the mummy is now lost. In September 1714, it had become clear that the king's goals in southern Europe would not be realized. With a daring ride through Europe and enemy lands, the king arrived in Stralsund under Swedish rule, and in 1715 made his way to Sweden. We now skip forward. Trying to neutralize the Danish threat, King Charles XII decided to invade Norway, a Danish province at the time, in 1718. The army made its way north and lay siege to the fortifications at Fredrikshall in Norway. On the 30th of November 1718, in the dark of the night while inspecting the trenches, the king was hit in the head by a fragment and died immediately. The corpse was hastily moved back to Sweden and the campaign abandoned. However, the body needed to be preserved and then transported for burial in Stockholm. And here it gets interesting. The field surgeon Melchior Neumann was responsible for handling the king's corpse. It took several weeks before the embalming of the body could begin, since he had to wait for all the needed ingredients to be bought and delivered. In total, Neumann ordered over 70 ingredients and aromatics, weighing about 23 kilograms in total, or about 50 pounds. The embalmment began on Christmas Day 1718 and took 3 days. The body was opened, and all the soft parts and intestines were removed. They were cleansed in warm salted water, and thereafter put in a bowl filled with the finest of French brandy that was changed every second hour for 2 days. The cavities of the body were wiped clean and dried. After that, the body was anointed with different spirits every hour until noon of the 26th of December. On that afternoon, it was anointed with a tincture of myrrh and aloe, mixed with other balsamic herbs. This process lasted until the evening of the 27th. On that night, the full body was lubricated again, wiped dry and cleansed once more. The cavities were once again wiped with balsamic tinctures. At this point, also the king's heart was embalmed. Thereafter, it was placed back in the body, after which the body was filled with herbs and spices and closed again. Once more, the body was cleansed, and after that, the king's carcass was wrapped in linen and cloth bandages that had been dipped in wax and aromatic oils. Finally, the wrapped body was shrouded and dressed in a simple white linen clothing. In this state, the body was later buried and found in pristine condition at the grave opening that was made in 1917. In the end, the young king that had shown such interests in ancient Egypt and mummies himself got embalmed, much in accordance with ancient principles. He rests in the church on the Knights Island in Stockholm, and his grave has been opened on 3 occasions. His body is still well preserved. That was all. Thank you for listening. Hi again. If you like this video, hit that like button and share a link with your friends. And don't forget to subscribe. And if you would like to help me make even better documentaries about the past in the future, please consider joining me at Patreon. I've put a link to my site in the description below. Thank you for watching.